So I'm chatting in English because the lecture is going to be in English as well. So Paul's going to chat slowly, and not using the very difficult language, so it should be quite easy for you to follow it. You can make notes if you want, because if you find an interesting subject, maybe which you would like to use for your paper along the road in big history, make some notes. You can also ask questions. It's no problem if you ask your question in Dutch. English is also fine, of course. So let's start. Well, this is Paul Mason. He's from the University of Utrecht. He's assistant professor in the Faculty of Geosciences and doing quite a lot of research on ancient rocks and sediments. He's getting rocks from Australia, South Africa, and those are rocks which are not really deformed or changed, so they contain traces of very ancient life. And he's going to talk about it. He's also some relations with research for life on Mars, which is also quite interesting, but I don't think you're going to chat so much about that. And I really would ask everybody, be quiet, so everybody can understand and hear the lecture as well. Yes? All right. Thank you.
Okay, goedemiddag. I have in my hands a piece of rock, and this is quite a special piece of rock. It looks like a duck pan, as somebody said to me about 10 minutes ago, but it's not. This is the oldest fossil that we have on Earth. It's 3,500 million years old, so 3.5 billion years. And you might wonder how we can see from a piece of rock, which looks like a duck pond, that we had life on Earth 3,500 million years ago. And I'm going to show you this afternoon how we do that. That's what I'm going to talk about. You can have a look at this if you want. We can pass it around the room. There you go. It's from Australia. It comes from the desert, the Woestijn, in northwestern Australia. And have a look at it, and I will explain this afternoon what we do with these rocks. So I'm from England, and I've lived in the Netherlands for about 16 years. My oma is from Nijmegen, so I'm a quarter Dutch. Ik ben from kwart Nederlander. So if you want to ask questions, you can ask me in Dutch, that's no problem. If you want to stop me during the talk, just put up your hand or call out and I'll answer your question. So to start off with, here's a photograph of a volcano. And you might also be wondering, why show a picture of a volcano when we're talking about life? Well, some of the life that we're looking for in these very old rocks survived under very extreme conditions, very high temperature, places where we have a lot of chemicals which are very poisonous, very toxic for life. And I'll show you how that works this afternoon. I want to talk about the first life. We live on Earth. Here's our planet. It's very special. In the solar system, we have Mars very close, we have Venus. There's no life on either of those planets, as far as we know. On Earth, we have water, we have volcanoes, we have plates moving around at the surface of the Earth. We have oxygen in our atmosphere. It's a really great place to live. But some of those things, like the atmosphere, the oxygen, that wasn't there when the Earth started. That came later. And if it wasn't for the volcanoes that we have, like here in South America, we wouldn't have life either. Now, what I want to talk about today is what is the earliest life? What did it look like? Because it didn't look like you and I. It was very different. When did it appear? And where did we find it on the surface of the Earth? What type of place was it? Was it on land? Was it in the sea? Those kind of questions. This is what we can talk about in universities as earth scientists, geologists. We can't answer the question why we're here or how we came to be here, but we can look at the what, when and where. So to start off with, what was the earliest life? Does anybody know? If you go back 3 billion years, what would life look like? Bacteria, that's right. Yeah, and this is actually a picture, a photo of a bacteria. Bacteria, of course, are really small. We can only see them under the microscope. We can't see them with our eyes. They're very tiny. And in order to think about what they were, we need biologists to help us. And biologists look at RNA, ribosomal RNA, and they've made what we call the tree of life by looking at how the RNA in all the cells is linked together. Not DNA, but RNA. And you can make this tree of life, and it has 3 different parts. Here we have bacteria, at the top left-hand side. We have something else called archaea, which are a little bit like bacteria. They're very similar to bacteria. And then here we have the eukaryotes. This is us, animals. And we're right next to fungi and slime mold. Slime mold, that's the green stuff which grows on rocks outside. So you can see there's lots of things on this tree which you don't really know very much about. Many of them are microscopic and many of them are very simple. But what's special here is that all of these types of life go back to one point. And biologists can tell us that. We've only had one period of evolution on Earth, and we're all linked back to the same point. And we call that the last common ancestor. So life only started once, as far as we know, on Earth. And what we want to know is, when did this happen? What was the time, the point of time at which that happened? All of these bacteria we find today all over the world, and there's also many bacteria in your body. And you might not know this, but there's more bacteria in your body than there are cells. In fact, there's about 6 or 10 times more bacteria in you than there are your own cells. You're carrying them around all the time in your skin, inside your gut. There's billions and billions of bacteria all around us. If you pick up a teaspoon of sediment, it will contain about 100 billion bacteria. So they're absolutely everywhere. And these are the things that we have to try and find back in time. And they can survive in the most outrageous environments. They can live at temperatures between -20 and 121 degrees Celsius. They can live across a complete range of pHs, so in boiling hot acid you can get bacteria living. And they breathe with lots of different chemicals. So we breathe with oxygen and we produce carbon dioxide. Well, bacteria can breathe with iron, or they can breathe with uranium, or chromium, or sulfates, lots of different chemicals. And the things they do are really remarkable. People have only known about this for 20 years or so, but it's incredible when you look at it. Yeah?
Why can they live in hotter places, but not in really cold places? Because -10 degrees isn't that cold. 121 is really hot, so...
Right, yeah, that's a good question. Well, -20 is not that cold for us, because we can wear warm clothes and we can protect ourselves from the cold very easily. But, you know, if you were to go outside naked at -20, you would really struggle. And it's the same for a bacteria. They can't grow very quickly at these very low temperatures, because all of the chemistry that they do slows down tremendously. It goes really slowly. So actually, when we look for bacteria on the Earth, we find them everywhere. They even live down to a depth of about 3 kilometers in the crust. So if you go straight beneath my feet 3 kilometres, you'll find bacteria all the way, and they're living there, and they're growing. And again, we've only known about that for about 15 years or so, but it's quite a remarkable thing. Why are they special? Well, they use energy from their surroundings, and they make chemical reactions happen. So here's a photograph from a scientific journal where they've shown some bacteria in a battery. Well, bacteria produce electricity. And you often think about them as being very simple organisms, but they discovered a lot of the things that we take for granted. They learned how to grow, of course, how to respire, how to move around, how to reproduce, how to attack each other, and how to work together. These were all things invented by bacteria, so they're really not as simple as you think they are. And one of the most incredible things about them is that they can change their surroundings. If we have 100 billion bacteria in a teaspoon of soil, then if they're all doing the same thing, they can change the surroundings really easily, just as much as we do, human beings. We think we invented climate change, but actually we didn't, because bacteria invented it about 2 billion years ago. And they've been changing the planet continuously through its entire history. Now, this is a place called Yellowstone in the United States. Maybe some of you have been lucky enough to go there. I've never been. I'd really like to go to Yellowstone. And here we have a pool which contains this beautiful yellow sulfur. And this sulfur is there because the bacteria have produced it. They've enabled it to precipitate. They've made it precipitate near slab in the water. And they can also change the entire planet. And this diagram shows time across the bottom. Here's 4 billion years ago, here's today. And this is what we have in the atmosphere. This is oxygen. And this is percentage of present atmospheric level. So this is today's oxygen level. And if you go back in time, you see that the oxygen level goes down. And at the beginning on Earth, we had no oxygen in the atmosphere. And the reason we have oxygen today is because bacteria started to make it around this time. Yeah.
You see, like, that light is up at certain points.
Yeah.
Why don't you have that?
That's a really good question. Actually, we don't really understand. We're still trying to work it out. So we call this the GOE. It's the Great Oxygenation Event. It's when oxygen first appeared in the atmosphere. What we know is that bacteria that make oxygen started to grow around this time here. So around 3 billion years ago, we had bacteria that made oxygen. And it took quite a long time before we could get that oxygen into the atmosphere properly. And that's for a whole variety of reasons. There were lots of chemicals around that reacted with oxygen. So when you made the oxygen, you just lost it again straight away. You know, if you leave your bike outside in the rain, it rusts, right? Well, that rusting process is taking oxygen out of the atmosphere, and it's consuming the oxygen. And the same thing happened in the Archean. In fact, the whole planet rusted. We had a lot of iron in the ocean at that time, and it formed rust. And if you were able to go back in time to around 2.5 billion years ago, everything would be red. It would be just like Mars. It would be like being on a rusting planet. And it took quite some time before you could produce enough oxygen to get it into the atmosphere. Yeah.
Why is there a small bump in the line after animals closer by us now?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is because at that point in time, we buried a lot of carbon into the crust. We all burn coal. Well, we don't all burn it, but our power stations do. We drive cars with oil in the engines. Well, that oil and coal formed mainly at this point in time. We call it the Carboniferous, the Carbone period. And we buried a lot of carbon. If you take a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere and bury it, you release more oxygen. And actually, it's quite interesting. If we were to burn all of the carbon in the crust, we would consume all of the oxygen in the atmosphere. We'll never do that. we'll have there's plenty of other problems with burning carbon, like climate change and ocean acidification and so forth. So we'll never have that problem. But if we could do it, if we could take all the carbon out of the crust and burn it, we'd consume all the oxygen. Okay, so this is all down to bacteria. So they're amazing organisms. Now, it's our job as scientists to try and work out when these bacteria appeared and what they do. We want to know those two things. And now, bacteria, you can take them and you can grow them in the lab. If you're a biologist, you can study them under a microscope, you can grow them, you can see what they do to different chemicals in a test tube. Now, we can't do that with the Earth. We can't look at the Earth as a whole and work out how it works. We have to look at little bits of the Earth, like this rock sample, wherever it is, and then try and work out from that what was going on in the whole system. And that's what makes being a geologist very challenging, quite difficult. So to start off with, I want to talk about how old the Earth is. Maybe some of you know already. I've shown it already in the talk. How old is the Earth? Anybody? Yeah, that's right. 4.5 billion years. Well, until not so long ago, we didn't know that. So if you go back 100 years, or more than 100 years, the best information we had about the age of the Earth came from the Bible. And this man, James Ussher, was an archbishop, and in 1658 he calculated the age of the creation of the Earth, and he calculated it as the night before October the 23rd in 4004 BC. He did it really accurately. Quite how he could say it was October the 23rd, I don't know. But that's what he did. And that's what we thought until 1862. And if you said anything else, people would laugh at you. Who's this guy? What does he mean? Okay, so in 1862, a famous physicist, William Thomson, he was English as well, like me. He calculated that if the Earth was initially molten and you cooled it down, it would take between 20 and 400 million years to make the surface solid. So if the Earth is initially magma, it's hot, really hot. This is how long it would take for it to cool down. Okay, it wasn't supposed to do that, but that's okay. In 1956, that was the first time we were able to properly date the Earth, and we did that using isotopes, radioactive isotopes. So there's a few radioactive isotopes of uranium which decay very slowly, and we can measure them in rocks and we can calculate the age of the Earth. And we came to this age of 4.5 billion years. Now, okay, there we go. It's not working as it's supposed to, but that's alright. In 2001, we actually dated the oldest material that we found on the Earth so far, and we're still arguing about it today. And some of my colleagues in Australia are busy trying to measure this. And these are some of the oldest rocks that we have. So on the left-hand side here, we've got a geological timescale. So this is today, 4.5 billion years. The oldest rocks that we have are about 4 billion years. So this very early period of the Earth, we don't have much to look at. There's not much left. Most of it's gone. These rocks are from Canada, and they were found by colleagues from America, from MIT, Boston. But they're not the oldest material, because we have some minerals. These are tiny little crystals that we find in younger rocks, and we can date these as well. They're called zircons. They're made from the elements zirconium and silicon and oxygen. And these are really difficult to break. They don't melt easily. They don't get lost when you break if you break a rock in the Alps, for example. All those little grains of quartz and sand get moved in the river all the way down here to the Netherlands, and then they eventually go into the North Sea. And during that process, most of that rock dissolves, but some pieces don't. And zircon is one of the pieces that doesn't dissolve. This material is really difficult to get rid of, actually. Once you've made a zircon, you have a zircon forever. And actually, people have shown that these zircons can go down 200 kilometers into the earth and come back up again, and we still have them.
Can we make it?
We can make it, yeah, for sure. We're very good at making things like this as well, but this is made by the earth. We can actually date these minerals because they contain a lot of uranium, and we can see how old they are. So this here is actually the oldest bit of the earth that we have, that we've ever found. This is a zircon crystal, and you can see there's different ages within the same zircon because it can grow for a while in a magma, and then it can be carried in a river, and then later on in time it can get caught up in another volcano, and a little bit more can crystallize over the top. These are like little time capsules. They're really amazing. So we know how old the Earth is from these minerals. But that doesn't really tell us when life appeared. Well, I'm going to go on with that in a moment, but I want you to appreciate what these timescales mean. And in order to do that, I've shown you here a clock. And let's assume that we compress 4.6 billion years into 12 hours. So let's go back in time. We're standing here at 12 o'clock. And if we go all the way back, we get back to the formation of the Earth. Well, we've had humans on Earth for 0.1 of a second. For 0.1 of a second, we've had human beings. And if we go back to just after 11 o'clock, which gets us back down to here, we find the first jellyfish. And compressed into that 4 minutes are all of the major plants and animals that have appeared on Earth. So evolution has happened pretty quickly. If we keep going back in time, when we get to about 8 o'clock, we get the first multicellular organisms, so the first eukaryotes. And before then, all we had was bacteria. And we think that the first bacteria appeared shortly after 3 o'clock, 3:30. Some people think that life appeared very early on Earth, but it's hard to prove. So we had a huge amount of time where we had only bacteria, and all of our fossils come from very, very recently. And human beings have been here for hardly any time at all. So geological time is just huge, it's vast. Where do we go and look? Well, one of the nice things about studying ancient rocks is that you get to travel a lot. I work on Archean rocks, and I've been in Australia, and I've been in southern Africa a lot, and I've been up here in the Kola Peninsula, I've been in India, and one of the places where I do most of my work is in southern Africa. I'm going to show you that in a moment. These are bits of rock which have survived a very long time. So all of the rest of the planet here is much younger. Of course, in the Netherlands, we're sitting on top of some of the youngest rocks on the planet. We don't have any old rocks in Holland, right? People keep asking me, you're a geologist, what are you doing in the Netherlands? Well, geology is important here as well, of course, for other reasons. But this is one of the places I work. It's a beautiful place. It's in South Africa. There's a lot of wild animals here. We see all kinds of big game here, giraffe and leopards and elephants. It's a very nice place to go and visit. If you ever get the chance, you should definitely go to South Africa. And these are what some of the rocks look like. They look a bit like Engelse drop, don't they? Sweets. Yeah. Black and white. And each of these layers is a layer of sediment, so a layer of sand or mud, which has got compressed into a rock. And we can go and study these, and we can say something about ancient rivers and lakes and oceans. Here's one of my PhD students who's studying these rocks in a mine. So quite often we go underground because we can find very good samples there. can see a lot of rock around us. But more recently, we've been involved in an international drilling project to go and look at these rocks properly. Now, quite often at the surface, they're altered, they've been weathered by the rain and the wind, and the composition of the rocks has changed, the rocks are changed. So when we drill down, we can get good original clean samples. I've been working on this drilling project with people from 12 different countries. We've raised about $600,000 altogether to go and drill over 6 months or so. And if you're interested in this, you can go and look at it on this website, ICDP Online. They have lots of information there about drilling and why we do it. This is what the core looks like when it comes out of the ground. It was quite hard work. We had to look at these rocks every day. We'd get about 6 or 8 of these trays, and we had to go through and measure them and see what we were looking at. But we had a lot of fun as well. This is where I learned how to drive a car properly in the mountains, off-road. Now, what do we look for in the rocks? Well, the most obvious thing to look for, of course, is a fossil, just like the piece of rock that I passed around for you to look at. And this is what they look like. We have these little layers where you find shapes and structures which indicate that we have bacteria in the rock. And the oldest examples, they're called stromatolites, are from Australia, 3.47 billion years old. And that rock I passed around is a piece of this. This is what you're looking at. So this is the oldest fossil, we think. But the problem with looking at these rocks, when we look at them in detail, we can see lots of little blobs and bacteria-like shapes. They're really simple. A bacteria is usually round or long, like this. And you can make shapes like those as well out of grains of sand, which have nothing to do with bacteria. So my colleagues have been arguing about this for about 20 years, and they can't agree very well. Many of these fossils are probably not fossils at all. They're probably just little blobs of sand, which look like fossils. And this is a very famous journal, Nature, you may have heard of it. And in the same edition of the journal, somebody argued that these were fossils, and somebody argued that they weren't fossils straight away. So it's very difficult to do this. We can also look for molecules in rocks that are only produced by life. So in your body, you make chemicals like cholesterol. And cholesterol is a molecule which is only made by life. So we can go back in a rock, like this one, and see if we can find any cholesterol. There's a problem with that as well. These rocks, when you make them, they get baked in the Earth's crust at about 300 degrees Celsius. And that takes quite a long time as well. So these rocks get made over tens of thousands of years. What do you think would happen if you put a chicken in the oven at 250 degrees for 20,000 years? What would be left? Not much, right? Something black and very difficult to identify. It wouldn't be cholesterol. It'd be some kind of horrible black gunk. And that's exactly what we find in rocks. So this doesn't really work very well either. We can do this in very young rocks, but not in very old rocks. So we have another way of doing this, which is to look at the chemistry of the rock. And that's what my speciality is. We look at how bacteria change the chemistry of their surroundings. So here's a bacteria. It actually looks like this, but we'll draw it like this. And it breathes with this chemical, sulfate. We breathe with oxygen, this bacteria breathes with sulfate. And it spits out hydrogen sulfide, which smells really bad. We grow these things in our lab in Utrecht, and our lab smells really bad as well. So in the process, what this bacteria is doing is it's breaking the sulfur away from the oxygen. Both sulfur and oxygen have different isotopes, and I'll say a bit more about isotopes in a minute. Some of the isotopes are lighter than the others. They have different masses, they have different weights. The lightest isotopes are the easiest ones for the bacteria to swallow. The bacteria is lazy, just like you and I, and it uses the least amount of energy it possibly can to breathe sulfate. So if there's any sulfate around made from light isotopes, it uses it, and it leaves the heavy isotopes behind. These are stable isotopes. This is oxygen, for example. It has 3 isotopes, 16, 17, 18. This has nothing to do with radioactive decay. These are different types of the same element. You have different numbers of neutrons in the nucleus. And bacteria will always go for the lightest, because the lightest isotope makes the weakest bond with everything else. Now we can measure these things in our labs, and our laboratories in the university look quite impressive. They're very big. And this is one of our labs. Well, this is actually not one of our labs, but it's a photograph I found. It looks very similar. What we can do in here is measure isotope ratios. Now, microbes, so bacteria, kinetically, that means that has something to do with speed, right? Select lighter isotopes. So they take lighter isotopes faster than heavier ones. And we can measure that using this big machine. And this is quite a new type of instrument. It was only invented about 10 years ago. So that gives us lots of possibilities to look at these rocks in ways that we haven't done that before. And we have what we call an isotope toolbox. We can look at carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, iron, nickel, chromium, and oxygen. And all of these isotopes tell us different things about what happens in the environment. So carbon isotopes can tell us about photosynthesis. It's a very important process for making oxygen. Sulfur isotopes tell us about sulfate production, and so on. Here's me in the lab, about 10 years ago, look a little bit younger there. And we can look down the microscope at these tiny minerals, little parts of these rocks. And here we have a laser. We can fire the laser at the rock. It's just like something out of Star Wars. The laser hits the rock, it vaporizes. We can do it with really tiny bits of rock. We can take that vapor into this mass spectrometer here, and we can look at the isotope ratios. This is another machine that we have. Also, it looks really impressive, right? It's like something out of Star Trek. We put our sample in here, and this is called a secondary ionization mass spectrometer. If you're interested about it, go and Google it. These things are really expensive as well. And they measure these stable isotopes in minerals on a very small scale, 10 to 30 micrometers, and the micro here means there's 100th of a millimeter. It's really tiny. Okay, I'm a scientist, so I have to show results. And this is quite difficult to understand, so I'll just talk you through it very quickly. But this is time going across the bottom, and these are lots and lots of different samples that we've measured from lots of rocks. So these are periods of geological time. This Archean is very, very old. Now this is an isotope ratio. And what you can see here, this is an isotope ratio of carbon. It hasn't really changed very much going all the way back through time. There's something going on here, but this range is relatively flat. And what that means, actually, is that we had life going back all the way through time. We can use this isotope to tell us that. You might be a bit skeptical, but you might ask me, well, what's going on here? This is when we started to produce oxygen on the planet. Because we started to produce oxygen, we changed the isotope ratio of carbon. If we look at sulfur isotopes, we can see a big range here and a very small range here. And that's because we didn't have much sulfate in the ocean, in the early ocean. Sulfate is SO4, and we need to have oxygen around to make sulfate. So before we had oxygen, we didn't have much sulfate. And we can use these isotopes to say all kinds of things about oceans, life, atmospheres. It's really pretty smart what we can do. Now, in order to understand what happens in the past, we have to look at what happens today. These are people from our research group down in the Westerschelde, collecting sediment, which is mud to you and I. Sediment is mud, it's the same thing. We collect the sediment, we put it into little sampling devices, and we can take it back to the lab, and we can look at the bacteria which are living in that sediment and see how they respond to temperature, to different chemicals in the environment. We can look at the isotopes, so we can figure out what the isotopes are doing today, and then compare that with what happened in the past. And Marjolein invited me to give the talk today. She did her PhD with me 4 or 5 years ago. This is from her PhD thesis. So there you go, Stan, 2010. I couldn't resist the opportunity to show some of her data. She looked at these isotopes in different places, in a freshwater river, in an estuary, in a lake in the United States, in California, which is very salty. It's also a beautiful place to go and work. And we went to the volcano in Italy, a volcano, where these bacteria are also growing. And we looked at the isotopes in all of these different places, and then we can compare them back to the rocks. Now, isotopes are important, but in geology we have to work as a team. Here's a team of geologists on a field trip in Finland. We have to bring our results together from different approaches. People use different ideas. And when we do that, here we have our isotope data, here's our molecular biomarkers, and here are our microfossils. We can put all of that information together and then try and work out when life appeared in the rock record. And if we do that, we have very convincing evidence that we had life 2.7 billion years ago. And if we go before 2.7 billion years, we have a lot of question marks. It becomes a lot less clear what's going on down here. And then we can also make these nice stories about changes in the atmospheric oxygen level and in the ocean chemistry as well, using these isotopes. And you'll see that in the past we didn't have any oxygen in the ocean, we had lots of iron in the ocean. And as I mentioned already, that basically rusted, became solid. At one point we had a lot of sulfide in the ocean. It was a really horrible place to be. It stank. And it would have killed a lot of today's organisms. So, where did life begin? I want to ask you a question now. Where do you think life began? Who thinks that it began in the ocean, in the deep ocean? If you think it was the deep ocean, put your hand up. Oh, that's quite a lot of Right? Who thinks that life began on a beach? Who thinks life began on a beach? Not many people. Oh, yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And who thinks the life began close to a volcano? Alright, so what's the answer? Well, it's actually a bit of everything. It's all three. Life actually probably began in some sediment, which is like a beach, next to a submarine volcano, a volcano under the sea, next to a mid-ocean ridge. So there's a bit of everything. And they're good places for organisms to survive. You need water, you need heat, and you need chemicals. You get lots of chemicals on a beach, there's lots of sediment around. You get the heat from the volcano, you get the water from the ocean. And the ocean also protected life from ultraviolet light, which was a big problem a long time ago. Until recently, a lot of people thought that life began in what was called a primordial soup. So you just get all the right chemicals into some water, some lightning hits the surface of the water, and bingo, you create an organism. That's how we thought it began. But now we know a lot more, because back in 1977, when I was only 6 years old, there was a major discovery made, which was to find what we call these black smokers on the seafloor. We found these undersea volcanoes, and these are places where we now think that you can get the right chemical conditions to make life. However, we also find a lot of these organisms on beaches. These are called stromatolites. This is from a place called Shark Bay in northwestern Australia. And these are also really old. So, I said it was a bit of everything, a bit of primordial soup, a bit of black smoker, a bit of beach. What's right? Where did life begin? Did it begin here, here, or somewhere here, or maybe in here? People have been arguing about it for a long time. Some of my colleagues who are really smart did some calculations, and they worked out that it only takes between about 1,000 and 10,000 years to colonize the entire planet with bacteria. Everywhere on the planet would have bacteria within 10,000 years. So actually it doesn't really matter where life began, because in geology we can't see the difference between 10,000 and 1,000 years ago when we go back 3.5 billion years. We can't see that difference. And bacteria live everywhere, with the exception of very hot places. So if you go above 120 degrees, there will be no life anymore. And that's the only place on the modern Earth which is truly sterile. Bacteria even grow inside nuclear reactors. Now some guys at NASA thought it would be fun to make a picture of what the Archean Earth looked like. This was the time when life first appeared. So here we have some volcanoes, we have an ocean, we have a beach, a hot spring here, and then some of these stromatolites. These are mats made of bacteria. And there's actually a lot that we don't know about this environment still. So a lot of people are researching this to try and figure out what type of bacteria were living there and when they appeared. So you might wonder how useful it is to do all of this. Well, biology and geology clearly change through time, but physics and chemistry don't. Everything you learn about physics and chemistry is the same wherever you are in the universe. If you're on Mars, you have the same chemistry and physics as if you're on Earth. So if we understand the chemistry and the physics about how life appeared, it should be exactly the same as a distant planet around a star which is billions of light years away from here. And this cartoon is about chemistry. I'll just put it in because I like it. But it's all about bonding, right? Bonding between different metals and anions. And these forces involved in bonding are the same wherever you are in the universe. Yeah.
Do you believe that there's more life at our planets in the universe?
That's a good question because I want to say something about it now. Yeah. So thank you. So one of my colleagues actually did some calculations. One of the guys I know who works in Washington in the United States, he actually calculated that if there is intelligent life somewhere else in the universe, it has to be breathing oxygen. Because he was able to work out that all the other chemicals that we can possibly use to breathe don't give you enough energy to have an intelligent mind. There's one exception, which is fluorine, but fluorine reacts explosively with organic matter. So if you breathe fluorine, you would explode. That produces more energy than oxygen, so maybe there's some intelligent life somewhere that breathes fluorine. This is quite remarkable, because it means we can go to other planets and we can start to think about whether there was life there or not as well. A lot of people are interested in Mars at the moment, because we have the Curiosity rover rolling over the surface, collecting samples, making measurements. And if we go back in time, this is what Mars would have looked like. So the picture I showed you 2 slides ago for the early Earth was at the same time that this picture has been drawn for Mars. And they look very similar, don't they? In fact, Mars was probably a nicer place to live 3.5 billion years ago than the Earth was. It was potentially slightly warmer. And it had rivers and lakes and mountains. It could have been a really good place for bacteria to live. So it might not be surprising if during our lifetimes, at least during your lifetimes, we actually find on Mars evidence for past life. It could well happen. And some people think that we all came from Mars. So some colleagues of mine did an experiment to show that bacteria can survive on meteorites, and they can travel from planet to planet. So it's possible that life started on Mars. Early bacteria hitched a ride on a piece of meteorite that hit the Earth, and then life carried on here. So we might all be Martians. All of us. And there could well be life elsewhere as well. Here's a picture of planet Kepler 22b. So we have a telescope in space, the Kepler telescope, busy finding lots of planets, extrasolar planets. We found that more than 1,000 planets have been found so far. And it's recently been estimated that there are 40 billion Earth-sized planets in what we call habitable zones, so places where there's water and life. And that's a low estimate. I heard somebody else argue that there were 10 to the power 20 planets similar to Earth. So if there's that many planets, the chance of finding life is pretty high. I think it is. I would think it'd be incredibly surprising if we're alone in the universe. And that's very exciting. Okay, I have to finish now. Yeah, I've gone on a little bit too long. Last thing I want to say is, you might think this is all very interesting, but why is it useful to spend lots of money doing this kind of research? Well, along the way we've made all kinds of other discoveries. So the people that have worked on early life have discovered new antibiotics, and they've discovered bacteria which wouldn't have been discovered if we hadn't done this kind of research. So it's useful for society at large. This is my team in Utrecht. You see Marjolein in the middle here. They've helped produce all these kind of ideas and data, and I have to stop now. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for this great talk. I hope you all enjoyed it and learned a lot more about first traces of life on Earth, where you could find them, etc. So, well, if you are interested, you can also look at the website of the University of Utrecht, Geoscience. There's also quite some information. Well, and of course, we would like to thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I hope you got also a lot of ideas for your paper, etc., for the big history classes, or just learned a lot and enriched your knowledge. Thank you very much. Well, hope to see you next year again. Okay, well, and just if you have a question, you just can come by and ask the question. Thank you all very much for listening as well.